I'm not going to do a huge rambling intro today because I think most of you will be aware of Georgijs Ivanovs and his fantastic channel, Ukraine Matters, and the extraordinary support he's been giving Ukraine, both informational and material support, through the course of the conflict over almost 4 years. We're going to dive in because there is a ridiculous amount to talk about, and it's late, and we have a short window of time to capture all of that. I'm delighted to welcome you back.
It's such a pleasure to talk to you again, Jonathan, and to be able to speak to your audience. They're all wonderful people. Let's definitely talk about it because the news just can keep coming.
I even have a better class of troll I tend to boast about on the channel here. Even the trolls are, you know that there's a certain level of decorum that has to be observed or they get banned. But anyway, let's ignore the trolls. I mean, joking aside, it is quite an extraordinary day. It's a tragic day as well because a leading figure of Ukrainian democracy, someone who's come from, originally he was from sort of the more nationalist wing of politics, but he moved towards a centrist pro-European position. One of the civic leaders of the Maidan protests and the Orange Revolution has been gunned down in cold blood in Lviv. It is shocking, of course. It's not shocking if we consider that Moscow wants to eradicate democratic culture. But nonetheless, it is an appallingly brazen and brutal act. What's your impression from what we know so far?
I mean, like, I don't want to sound cynical, but it is war and people die in war. I wouldn't be surprised that potentially we would, like, I mean, in the Europe, we already had poisoning. There has been burning of vehicles by Russians. And I'm not that surprised about the killing of the person because I am subscribed to the Ukrainian internal security news channel. So where they post like we apprehended this insurgency group, we apprehended these terrorists that tried to blow up things. Then there was a killing of one of the Ukrainian, I believe he was a colonel from the internal forces.
That's
So
right, yeah.
there has been a lot of these assassination attempts. I was a little bit surprised when I heard about Parubi, specifically because he hasn't been that, at least not in any kind of format that I know of. Potentially, he was doing a lot behind the scenes that I just do not know of, and that is truly possible because he did have very strong opinions, but he wasn't per se as a very known and wide public person right now. He was definitely beforehand. So I think the reasons why it was specifically targeted him are a little bit vague for me. I don't think I have enough information to judge on it. But also, I know that a lot of these killings and bombings and everything, there is about a 10 of them per day. It's just the Ukrainian SBU is pretty good at apprehending most of them.
Yeah. And yes, if you get the sense of how many plots are out there, then perhaps it's not surprising the odd one will get through. The choice of figure, of course, is extraordinary because, again, one of the previous figures that was assassinated in a similar fashion was again someone who's come from the more sort of, very strong national identity kind of background, very strong. And that was an assassination in Lviv again. So there is a pattern here of targeting Ukrainian patriots because I think it sends a signal. It sends a signal that Russia is seeking to erase Ukrainian identity. And those that are some of the strongest adherents to that, some of the strongest thinkers behind Ukrainian identity, it's basically saying, well, you're a target. We are, of course, assuming that Moscow is behind this. We don't know for sure, and this is an ongoing investigation. But of course, the probability is pretty high that it's either a direct Moscow agent or one of their proxies. And of course, they tried to kill Sternyenko just the other day as well. He is much more active in terms of sourcing drones and, kinetic material to push back against the invader. You don't well, we were talking just before we hit record. You make a point of not covering Trump's every sort of verbal belch and utterance, because it's not only is it distracting, it also distracts from more strategic things that are going on. So, what's your core focus? If you want to sort of, why do you think it's not so important to follow Trump, and what do you think are the important stories that are breaking over the last couple of weeks and months?
Well, I think it's a very good leeway. So I again, like, I just don't find Trump that fascinating. I think the impact that the US excluded themselves from the aiding Ukraine or being like a big stakeholder in Ukraine. When I look at Kiel Institute data for aid to Ukraine, you will see that 2025 it's just zeros, except for the small part that was done by Biden at the very start of the year, basically. And that's it. Like there is like zero zeros of aid coming from US. Everything else that's coming from US is just purchases. Like Europeans, me, like my taxes are paying for this. That's purchase. That's not the same as just aid to Ukraine. So in that sense, they're just selling stuff. So they're in the same category as something like Pakistan or potentially Turkey and other countries that are in this semi-neutral state where they just like sell stuff. Okay, fine, fine. We can understand that. And then there is the political aspect, which I don't find very fascinating because the premise of Donald Trump's administration is very flawed. I can go into depth explaining his logic about how that he wants to get a deal with Putin and maybe get Putin and Zelensky in the same room so they talk and so on. That is like, let the Trump analysts dig into it in some other show. But the point of the matter is that he just wants Ukrainian problem gone. Like he's really annoyed. He wants to be friend with Putin and go back to business, make money. What he doesn't completely get is like just Putin doesn't care about money. Putin has like more money in the world. Everyone thinks it's the Elon Musk that is the richest person in the world. Absolutely not. Like it is clearly Putin because Putin he doesn't care about money. Money stopped being like a thing that he is even considering in his life. It's all in higher levels where right now for him. So they just don't align in his in Putin's desire to write himself into the history book with Donald Trump's desire to just enrich himself or his family. That's just different types. So the only way that he can do it then is he can sort of a sell off Ukraine, but he already did that. And first of all, foremost, Ukraine didn't collapse then and didn't really felt that it was completely disastrous. Yes, it was problematic. There were certain issues, but Ukrainians have been also working for the last half a year to find alternative solutions. They would still want to get, for example, missiles or support or buy weapons from US stockpiles. That would be super helpful for Ukraine. And that is happening. So that is fine. But when he says like, okay, we're just gonna push on Ukraine so it gives the territory away to Russia, that is not what's gonna happen. That is not gonna happen. Ukraine is not gonna give Russia anything that they don't own. And so people like, oh, it's like, oh, Russia is about to collapse. No, they're not. No, no, they're not. No, that's simple as that. There is no situation on the ground that is uh, putting Ukraine in a position where it must accept anything that Russia is asking from there. And the fact that Trump's administration envoy Steve Witkoff cannot understand what Putin is telling to him, well, that's their problem, not ours. And the fact that we're discussing this right now and spending time instead of talking of some of the other things like how is the core reform in Ukraine ongoing? What kind of resources they are using right now? What about the new missile campaign? Those are much more important and much topics that are actually getting us closer towards the end of this war, rather than discussing what is happening in the next 2 weeks. Oh, it's like the best joke. Like I'll finish with this. The best joke that I've heard so far is that it was saying is like there was one day and Trump put up ultimatum to Putin and says, Mr. Putin, if you will not stop this war in 2 weeks or before September, then the autumn will come. And that's it.
Yes. And there seems to be a pattern, doesn't there? There's an absolute pattern of the US sort of putting themselves front and center of the news headlines, at least, which pushes out, as you say, more meaningful stuff. So they sit there as a kind of news feed parasite. You know, it's going to be peace, it's going to be peace, it's going to be peace. Then there's an ultimatum. Then that all falls apart. Then it's like, oh, this isn't working. We're going to withdraw from it. Pause, pause, pause. Then they come back in, take center stage. It is a form of news media parasitism because actually, as you said, they're contributing nothing. They are really doing very little when it comes to the strategic impact that Ukraine is having. That is coming from a lot of their domestically produced armaments and those that are produced by their industry in collaboration with, say, Germans, Danes, and others. The US is essentially leeching off the story while really sort of, either deluding itself or pretending it has some kind of leverage. Let's turn to what the actual strategic story is, because I talked about this with Ben Hodges, and this idea struck me that what we're actually seeing unfold is a kind of siege of Moscow, not in the traditional sense, like a medieval siege engine surrounding the city, poisoning the wells, etc. But we're seeing a remote, high-tech version of that, which is highly targeted, severing the arteries of Moscow. Moscow runs on a vast system of resources, oil and gas networks. It runs off resources that are not dug up in Moscow or even processed in Moscow, but all the wealth and the luxury goods, etc., that it enables come to that place. What we're seeing is Ukrainian strategy to piece by piece cut it off from the airline industry, harrying the airports to the oil and the gas. And I suspect that if this strategy continues, we're going to start to see not just dual use, but civilian logistics and pipelines starting to get hammered as well. And actually, I mean, I'd love to hear your thoughts. I think Ukraine absolutely needs to continue now with this strategy and not allow any allies or pseudo allies like the US to pressure it to stop this.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, like you obviously can consider it. There is a good counter argument that I've heard stating that that the strategic bombing campaign never won a single war. True, true. That has been very very true. The problem that Russia is finding themselves in, and why the strategic bombing campaign that Russia, when they invaded Ukraine, they were not expecting that 3.5 years later, they suddenly gonna strategically get bombed by the same country they invaded and supposedly were about to capture within a week. But Russia, they're greedy. They're overextended. They overcommitted. Putin has basically went all in. Like if I can put some kind of card or casino terms here, he went all in. He dedicated all of the resources to war. He overstrained his economy. Like, all of their economy right now is suffering. Not because actually, well, sanctions help, everything helps, but the main and most important thing that is pressuring Russian economy is the war itself. It is a high intensity, large scale war that requires full commitment. And not just that, Putin decided to go into the long term format with this war, like to go into resource warfare, the exhaustion warfare. And the attrition warfare, the problem of attrition warfare is that the resource dedication must go up. Like that's just the rule of that attrition warfare. It's because if you kind of one up your opponent, then your opponent needs to sort of a one up you, and then you need to one up, and then the opponent needs to one up. So the spending on the war and the resource dedication towards the war always tends rising, always needs to be rising. And that's just the nature of that exhaustion and attrition warfare. And that was what drove Russia to now have over 60%, to some estimates say, when you count in all of the secondary parts and the hidden parts of the budget, that 60% of the budget are now committed to their war-related activities. They don't have the time to commit to economy. One of the reasons why a lot of the oil infrastructure right now is actually breaking, and this is we know that it's being struck by Ukrainians, but we also know that right now it's just breaking or going into maintenance. Why? Because they were prohibited for 3 years to go into maintenance. They were prohibited to do these yearly repairs and restorations because this is war. We need to overcommit, and they overstretched and overcommitted themselves. And Ukrainians beforehand, if they would struck the oil refineries and so on the same, it would be a big problem for Russia, but it wouldn't have a catastrophic effect. It would be just a problem for Russian economy. It would give them time to adapt. But the big issue that they're having right now is that siege that you referenced to is happening also at the time, if you put it in some kind of medieval terms. So one of the ways sieges were working just to starve up the fortress, so because the fortress storming of the fortress was just too resource intensive, so the opposing force would set up a siege, and then it prevent any resource entering the city, therefore starving the people that are inside the city. Well, for Russia, the problem is they were already sort of a starving. And now, if there is suddenly a siege and cut off of these resources, then it's like you're way, way, way worse situation than you could have ever been beforehand. And that is basically the whole thing. Putin was greedy, he overcommitted, he overplayed his hand, and now Ukraine just slapped him on the whole hand holding the cards.
And the starvation is not just against civilians, because we have to point out that actually Russian civilians will put up with almost any hardship. They're not going to come out on the streets. There's not going to be a revolution. They'll be eating the cats and dogs, to use the phrase, before anything bad happens there. And even then, they'll just put up with it. But the key thing here is that if the regime is starved of resources, they have a huge community of Siloviki and loyalists and mafia and scum and thugs who are dependent on the largesse of the state. So this attritional strategy, I don't think is quite so critical for any kind of civic revolt, but it is absolutely critical to undermine the resources the regime needs to pay off basically its heavies and its thugs and its loyalists, and of course to rustle up new bodies for the war because it's very expensive to offer contracts when people die to give that money to the families and so on. So this really is starving the war machine and the terror state of the resources that it needs to function. I think that's a critical point.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. You're hitting the nail on the head right there. Russian war machine is really, really struggling. Like they're pulling a lot of resources. I want to underscore that this doesn't mean that suddenly Russian economy is going to collapse. Economies are a lot more flexible systems. And while Russia spent all of their resources that they've saved up for the state, they still have plenty of resources that they can start cutting. Now, for people in Moscow, for them, war didn't exist ever. They didn't feel it one bit. For people in bigger cities, it wasn't a problem so much yet, but they are starting somewhat to kind of experience like there is like some rumors that there was issues with gas here and there. They see the gas prices rising, right? They're not as rich as people living in Moscow that can like, okay, gas, whatever. Like I need to own the car. So it is going to be definitely putting pressure, but there is still a lot of fat tissue that Russia can take from before they need to cut into something vital. So that's why I advise everyone to be careful in your expectations. Definitely, it can cause a significant collapse. It can cause, but the same reason we can say Putin can die tomorrow if because the age is already with him as well. Like he's not a young man. But this is something we could be prepared for. We should support and we should continue doing this because it is bringing results. But yeah, I would be careful with experiencing and setting some kind of time frames for this.
And I see in a lot of the pro-Ukraine community, there's endless frustration with Europeans saying, and this is amplified by, I think, unfortunately, disingenuous Americans also. It's kind of, why doesn't Europe pull their weight? Europe's doing nothing, blah, 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 blah. Um, are we perhaps distracted by, I think, what you called the theatre of managing Trump? There's a certain kind of political theatre to try and just keep him from doing crazy stuff. And people take that as almost appeasement. They take it as there's nothing else going on apart from that. That's not strictly true, though, is it? I mean, Europe seems to have woken up to the threat of Russia. Perhaps not all the measures are being taken that are needed. But the people I speak to say no, you don't underestimate that that many European leaders now are fully apprised of the threat Putin represents in a way they weren't 3 years ago. They are aware that Putin will not stop until he is stopped, which is the message that we've been trying to push for 3 years. So what perhaps is going on behind the scenes? And the phrase that Macron used, that Putin is the ogre at the gate. I think that's very visually important, and it implies that there's this realization that this isn't, Putin threatens all sorts of things globally, but fundamentally he threatens Europe. He's at the gates of Europe, and it's up to Europe to actually deal with that problem because no one's going to ride in and rescue us from this.
Yeah, I mean, I've been one of the biggest critics of Europe. Like half of the people that quit watching my channel was because I was saying something bad about their country, and they took it very personally. Like I don't hold my my breath before I need to tell anything bad. With that said, Europe is doing a lot. Europeans have stepped up massively. I'll tell you when was the moment when I fully understood the switch that we're on. Like it's like if beforehand this year before Trump came, I was kind of like, it seems that we're kind of like semi on, but we're not engaged. Then there was kind of like a flick of a switch, and now we're engaged. There was two big things that I noticed that absolutely switched me in like no, Europe is like we are now in the do mode and like maybe talk later mode. The first one was when Trump came to power, and there was a discussion with European leaders about what is the relationship with the United States we need to build. And there was two kind of camps. One was that Europe should aim for strategic independence, that Europe should be focusing on our European assets, that there should be multiple polarities within the world. There is the China polarity, then there's the US polarity, and then Europe with our own interest. And we need to be self-sustaining, self-sufficient. And then there was the second one, who was, I think, the most spearheaded by is Alexander Stubb, the Prime Minister of Finland. I specifically zero out him because he also was the sort of a winning party. He was the one who brought in the plan, the approach, and that was accepted by the European leaders. And his plan right now is the foundation in which Europe is acting. And at that moment, there was started appearing some talks about appeasement to Trump. Where people came, started making some of the gifts to him and sweet talking, and that was when I was like, well, this is potentially not good, because one thing is we can just give up and just submit to Trump and just say you're still U.S., you are doing what we do, and we want to follow your lead. And the second was whether or not we're going to be doing something on our own. So if we would be sweet talking Trump but not doing anything at home, then we are screwed. At that moment, I would give up on Europe because we're gone. But that is not what happened. What happened was the second part, where yes, we talk with US, we're trying to mitigate some of that damage, potentially working towards the next administration and preserving some of that Atlantic cooperation. And in the same sense, we also, in the background, start heavily working on setting up our strategic independence. And that is exactly what is happening. Europeans have, there was the calculations, we tripled the amount of space that our factories, military factories. Rheinmetall is known to open at least 5 new factories, just the one that we know of, like for major production of equipment and so on. We now have
Ammunition is sixfold, I believe, from
yeah,
Rheinmetall year on year. Pretty major.
correct. The production of everything is scaling up. I was having the pleasure to talk and ask the question to some of the European military people, and I know their plans. We are heavily being weighted down by the weight of our bureaucracy. A biggest example for it would be, for example, in Denmark, we have the drone fighting team, but they cannot fight any drones because the use of electronic warfare system is prohibited on the territory of Denmark. So we have the counter drone forces that cannot really train or do any counter drone fighting. And that is the example that we're giving. So we're still working towards it, but the fundamental shift was there, like it happened. And then the second moment was the support for Ukraine. What I needed to find out is whether or not Europeans will support Ukraine when US is out. And that's exactly what will happen. US is out, zeros. And now when you look at the support that is coming for Ukraine, the aid that is coming for Ukraine, it is now more than it was before when it was Europe together with US. So Europe alone is now supplying more in funds to Ukraine than it was beforehand together with US. We are stepping up intensely. And most importantly, the more smart usage of those resources. Instead of us just sending in some weapons and then buying or ordering ourselves something new and shiny, the model that was proposed by Biden, which was absolutely inhumane model, in my perspective, it's just like, let's give us old stuff to you and you use our old stuff and we're going to buy something new.
In fact,
Instead,
most of that
now
money from Biden stayed in the States, and actually many of the things that were mandated to send to Ukraine, first hand or second hand, never actually arrived. It's extraordinary, scandalous sort of policy.
Correct, correct. It's, I mean, well, I'll talk about that maybe afterward, private conversations. But the most important is that Europeans are investing in Ukraine, not just sending weapons, they're investing in Ukrainian production. Like they are building factories in Ukraine. That is the quintessential because you cannot just win wars by just sending. Well, I mean, look, if you don't win wars with the stocks that you have, well, then you're screwed. But if you're using your stocks to buy you time while you build factories and energize your production, well, then suddenly you're going to have a bigger output at some point. And again, this is a resource warfare. And everything has been very smart behind the scenes. Everything was very intense. And as I said, two tests that I put up to Europe to say that Europe is doing their part, and I maybe should back away a little bit with criticizing, have been truly and utterly proven to me that no, we're on the right track. Can we do more? I mean, of course we can. Like it's a fair critique to always say that we need to do everything that we can for Ukraine, and potentially the faster this problem goes away, the faster we can go back to normal. And there is a lot of case to be made. Fair enough. But we're definitely doing stuff. Like, so it's not fully fair to say Europe is not lifting the weight. Europe of Ukrainian allies are the ones that are lifting all the weight.
And, without going into too much detail of your personal experience, I think this is a fascinating question as to whether it's better to send pre-configured kind of kit at a high unit cost, and maybe the stuff is less flexible, especially when we're considering drones and electronic warfare, or is it better to actually have joint ventures and collaborations with Ukraine, where we provide resources, skill sets, maybe materials, but actually produce stuff which are more open source platforms that are more sort of extensible and agile, and do them in collaboration with Ukrainians who actually have this feedback loop from the front, so that they can iterate stuff and actually, give a more up-to-date specification. What's the best model for making resources go further and assisting Ukraine?
Both for very stupid reasons. The best one would be obviously collaboration with Ukraine. That is because Ukrainians right now are at the forefront, and a lot of the solutions that we thought will be working are actually not working. But we see how that already is influencing. There was recently news about that UK will be developing new missile type, like a short range. It's like 600 kilometers, tactical missile, sort of like an ATACMS alternative. No US components. Everything, I believe, is going to be British made. Fantastic. And the focus is on large scale production. It might not be the state of the art, but it needs to be produced and scaled to a larger production, and it needs to be relatively cheap. So we already see different type of approach that Ukraine and cooperation with Ukraine brings. But as for why we should produce ourselves, there is a good argument, and there is like a very difficult one, very stupid one. The good argument is that Ukrainians they're very much in the moment. They are looking for what is good now. Like they have ideas what can be working in the future in these environments, but they're not looking for sort of a what can work now and what we can produce to put into stockpiles so it can potentially work also later. That is not the point of Ukrainians. Ukrainians are not thinking like this. They're not considering how to do it. Um, they oftentimes Ukrainians are very good technically, but they're focusing on a very narrow specific problem because they have engineering mindset instead of having like a mindset of how do we make something that is well integrated and brings additional benefits to some things. And those kind of questions can better be answered when a person is a little bit far away from problems, sort of like an academic sort of a discussion. And for that matter, our universities are and our environments with laboratories and the way that we're working in the Western world is much better suited for. Like we definitely have that potential longer term vision, more different whole-sided approach. We start thinking about what could be the countermeasures and preemptively build in like the solutions for it, and then we can actually do the bleeding edge solutions. True. And then there is the stupid thing. And the stupid thing is that our countries want to invest in our countries. That people that want to have development of weapons, they don't want to send as much money to Ukraine as they would like to see spent in their countries, which makes sense. Like when you start thinking about, yeah, obviously it's constituencies, democracies, we need to be spending money in our economies. That all makes sense. But obviously it's a lot less efficient than you would spend the money in Ukraine.
And it ignores the absolute urgency of the situation as well. Um, well, we probably haven't got time for a huge number of topics, but I think one of the other ones that we sort of started to bring up with Ben Hodges, and he raised some really interesting military, not objections. He wasn't saying we absolutely can't do this. He was saying that here is what makes it complicated, and that is the idea of closing the skies. Do you think this is an important step, as opposed to boots on the ground, which seems less realistic, for Europeans to take to show their commitment to actually defending Ukraine, to pushing back against the Russian invader, and the realization that Ukraine is an integrated part of Europe. It's European territory, and if Ukraine falls, then big chunks of Europe may well fall as well. It seems that closing the skies is another critical threshold we're going to have to cross at some point.
Should have been crossed 2022. Like to be honest, like I don't have a better answer. Because it doesn't cause any escalation. Like I mean, to be honest, like escalation management is in general like that is a whole red herring that I don't want to go into because it's going to take me half an hour to moan about how stupid that idea even is.
Your blood pressure would raise to dangerous
It's
levels
true, and we
probably as
don't
well.
want me stroking here. And so we don't need to invent the wheel. Just like we have the Western Ukraine, everything that is to the west of Dnipro, perfect. Open the air. What is it called the airports in that region, and in start patrol missions. Close the skies. That's it. That's it. It's the only humane thing to do. Like, oh my God, there's like people killed by missiles. Close the sky. No, why are you not doing it? Because you can, but they're not doing it. And like most of the arguments that I've heard was just excuses. But you said you talked with Ben Hodges. Did he give any good arguments? Because I haven't
Yeah.
heard a single good argument.
One of the arguments is that yes, you can set the mission to primarily shoot down missiles, etc. But at some point, you will reach a situation where enemy fighters lock onto your jet, and you do not have the option to not fire back. You have literally seconds, if not less, to shoot the other aeroplane down, or else you're done. So it would inevitably result in direct fire incidents between Western jets shooting down or engaged in dogfights with Russian jets and shooting them out of the skies. I think he wasn't saying that that's impossible. He was just saying that this is a challenge. This is a political decision that would have to be made, and a very difficult one. But I think the argument here is that Ukraine is Ukrainian sovereign territory. Russian jets have no right to be over it, full stop. So it's less of a military challenge because if the politicians give the signal and say, yes, you can engage Russian fighters and take them down, then, you know, then you cross that Rubicon, as it were. It also requires, the construction of quite a few sort of bases and logistical supplies. You need a lot more sort of equipment in place than just the fighters. But again, this seems to me all to be political decisions, because if the political will is there, then, as Ben said, all the military technology exists, the skills exist, the resources exist. It's a fundamental political Rubicon that needs to be crossed. It's one that none of our countries has shown any willingness at this point to cross. We know that there are special forces of various countries potentially already, dare I say it, directly engaging Russian forces or helping to plan operations that engage Russian forces. So perhaps surreptitiously, this Rubicon has kind of been crossed already. But I think in terms of dogfights in the air, that's an extra set of balls which our leaders are going to have to grow to take that one on.
I mean, that's the biggest problem of Europe that I've been saying is the lack of balls. I mean, Turkey in 2015 shut down Russian jet, and now Russia is saying is like, oh, Turkey is such a good partner. It's like there is one answer that we need to give Russia if they say like, well, if suddenly there is like jet and we might target, don't target our jets. It's a closed territory. That's why it's called closed air. Don't target our fucking jets. Sorry for my language.
That's okay. It's late in the. It won't get us demonetized. It's late in the video. But no, absolutely, absolutely correct. And I think that's something that should have been done. That should have been a red line that was laid down very early on. We're Ukraine's allies, and you have no right to be in the air over it, especially shooting at civilian targets. Whereas we saw, women, children being massacred, which is horror, daily horror that kind of unfolds. Just a quick one. I know you're moving to news formats. What are the key stories that you are looking at to cover? And what are the key stories that you think have broken in the last couple of weeks that you've covered?
Well, I mean, the Russians' problem with the pipelines, we already discussed that. The state of Russian economy, as more and more economists are coming in with a half a yearly reviews, and they're just, yep, we are in recession because when you take away in Russian economy the main military industries, then everything else is already in the red. So Russia is in recession factually, and that's without talking about the cooking of the numbers that they're doing. So that's a definitely thing there. The ending of their national wealth fund, which is a whole another pack of worms, and the pressure on their central bank to lower the rate because it's purely political. So there's a lot of really fascinating things that are happening with Russia that I thought will happen only at the end of 2016 or 2016, 2026, but they kind of moved up. And it really feels that a lot of the problems for Russia just kind of escalating and spiraling lately out of control. The Ukrainian long-range capabilities, the new factories that are being built, the issues within their economy, the prices. It's really turning for a major perfect storm for Russia that they're right in the middle of.
And we know that winter puts additional pressure on all sorts of resources in Russia. And when heating starts to fail, and if they have ongoing problems with, say, fuel oil and petrol, then a lot of the stuff we're seeing unfold now will just be exacerbated by the winter period. Gyori, always a massive pleasure. We should do this more often, and I know the audience massively appreciate your insights and your forthright views, which at this point are to be welcomed. Thank you so much for coming back on.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you so much for everyone watching. Trust in Ukraine, trust in Ukrainian armed forces. We'll see you next time.